The first time they knocked on my door again, I almost laughed out loud because I remembered this exact face, this exact tone, and I remembered the last time I heard it over the clink of wine glasses and the applause for someone else's triumph. That dinner was the night they decided who I was going to be in their lives forever, and they did it so casually that I thought later maybe I had imagined it. I hadn't. You can still see a face that has learned to walk away from you as if it were nothing, and it will haunt you in small, ordinary moments for years. My family called it a celebration. They said we were gathering for Sarah's promotion, which in their mouth sounded like prophecy, like a coronation. She was 29, flawless in all the ways that mattered to them, neat hair, married to a man from the right city, a LinkedIn profile that read like a job advertisement for success. She was the golden child in every obvious way, and they loved her like they were starved for love and then fed only the prettiest parts of her. I sat at the end of a long table, hands raw from the shift at the diner that morning, listening to my mother tell our aunt about how Sarah had turned down 2 offers because she wanted the perfect fit. My mother smiled that soft smile she never used with me, the smile that rearranged the room. "You should be proud of her," she said to everyone, and I realized she was talking about my sister like she was a property. Nobody asked me what I did that week. Nobody asked whether I could afford the bus home. Someone poured more wine. Someone said, maybe you should go help clear the dessert. It wasn't a question. I went. I took plates with numb hands and a sharper awareness of my place. There were no real arguments that night, only tiny casual jabs that together made a rope. Dad made a joke about me finding my path while he clinked his glass against Sarah's, a capital P path that he and I both knew did not include the same kind of safety net. My brother-in-law told a story about a client who fired a project manager, and everyone laughed like I was the punchline. My sister sat glowing under lamplight, and they asked her about her trip, about the promotion, about whether she was thinking of children. They never asked if I was eating. They had always had a language for me that was thinly veiled cruelty. Different, they called me, sensitive, as if those were polite hand tools they used to carve distance. When I brought home a report card that was not perfect, they folded it like a newspaper and placed it on the couch between them. When I got pneumonia once and missed a week of school, my mother said, "You need to be tougher," as if illness were a character fault. When Sarah screwed up at work once and was late to a meeting, my father sent her flowers and a 3-paragraph email telling her how proud he was that she had the courage to be imperfect. When I screwed up, they called me disappointing at dinner and told stories about how I had always been temperamental. The message was clear. There was no home for my mistakes. I learned slowly to watch their faces the way you watch a storm. My sister's successes were always announced with all the theatricality of a weather report, and my failures were footnotes in the margins. They defended her fierce. When Sarah was drunk at a cousin's wedding and cried in the ladies' bathroom because she didn't think she was good enough, my mother hugged her and said, "Oh honey, you never have to prove anything to us." When I told my mother I had been late on rent and needed a few months to catch up, she said, "We did so much for you when you were younger, you should be more responsible." It wasn't only words. The house itself was arranged to show preference. Old photographs were cropped to favor her face. The mantel held trophies of her achievements, little metal things that somehow represented a lifetime of approval. My childhood bedroom sat ready like a stage set for Sarah's return if she ever wanted to reclaim it. Mine had a different fate. The door was left ajar and the light bulb removed, as if they were trying to keep me from ever lighting it again. I still remember the exact moment the room shifted from polite neglect to something more dangerous. Sarah had just announced the promotion and everyone applauded. My father, warmed by wine and triumph, smiled in that bland way people do when they are making decisions. He said, without malice but with a kind of casual cruelty that required no malice, "We can't keep supporting 2 people forever. Someone has to stand on their own. I'm sure you understand." People laughed, thinking it a joke. I felt my knuckles whiten on a plate. I understood, of course I did, because I had been told I understood since I was 12. But the joke had teeth. That night I didn't leave immediately. I dried the dishes and let their laughter soak into the china until it stained me. I drove home with the stereo off and the city lights looking like distant applause. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that maybe I should be grateful they cared so much about someone in the first place, that maybe my worth was in learning to be grateful for scraps. But gratitude is a dangerous thing to confuse with self-worth. The next morning, I packed a bag and left before my mother could decide. I needed another lesson in humility. I did not leave because of anger. I left because the little exchanges of their love had sewn themselves into a map that pointed away from me. I left because being there meant apologizing for being me every day. I left with a pocket of cash and an old toolbox and the vague, stubborn belief that if I could make something with my hands and my head, then maybe I could stop expecting handouts and start expecting a life. I did not know then the shape my leaving would take or how long it would matter. I only knew I was tired of rehearsing my own humiliation at their table. I thought leaving that night would be the end of awkward conversations and the slow poison of being the family's designated scapegoat. I was naive in ways I did not even notice then, like thinking that absence would soften the edges of their indifference, that distance might make them rethink the map they'd drawn of where I belonged. Months passed. I learned how to fix a plumbing leak with nothing but YouTube and a borrowed wrench. I learned how to sleep with the neon hum of a city bus stop outside my window and still wake up ready to clock in. I learned, in a very practical, painful way, how to survive. So when my father called and said we needed to talk about the house, I went. It felt like a test I could finally pass. The house had been the one place that carried their history like a slow bruise, and I convinced myself they might want to repair things. Maybe they would apologize, maybe they would explain. Hope is a bad fool, and I was still young enough to be fooled. They sat me at the kitchen table as if for the 100th time, the same table where I had been folded into the margins for years. My mother brewed coffee that tasted like apology and denial and placed it in front of me with hands that didn't tremble. My father pushed a stack of papers toward me. The pages were crisp and smelled faintly of the lawyer's office I had never thought I would need to know about. I reached out without thinking, reading the headings, and my stomach dropped. Mortgages. Equity release. Power of attorney, an amendment to the will. My name had been black inked out from more than one lines. My father looked at me like he was explaining weather. We had to act fast, he said. Sarah's company took a hit. There were investors breathing down her neck. She needed liquidity. We used the house to secure a loan for her payroll, and we changed the will so there's no future confusion. We thought about you, but we can't keep things complicated. He used words like liquidity and investors as if they were shields, like the facts could be a fortress between us. As my mother offered, we did what we had to do for family. When I asked how the house could be used without my knowledge, my sister sat there, hands in her lap, playing the part of the guilty child who had to be comforted. Sarah's smile was small and precise, the kind you practice in a mirror before a presentation. She said, "We didn't want to worry you. You were doing so well on your own." She didn't even look at my hands, which were still rough from removing a faucet that morning. There was no heat in her voice, only performance. The papers were signed. A notary had been there. A lawyer had called the week before to schedule signatures and had conveniently included a clause making the changes irrevocable without unanimous consent. I asked how that was legal. My mother said, "It is legal. We are of sound mind." My father added, "We thought this would protect the family legacy." Protect the legacy. I had been the loose stone they knocked out of the foundation to prop up her stairs. The final blow was not a document but a sentence so small and precise it felt surgical. My mother, with the same soft smile she used when presenting Sarah with flowers, said, "We can't keep supporting two people forever. Someone has to stand on their own. We've chosen Sarah." There was no apology in the choice. There was only a closing of the ledger. I realized then that I had been promoted in their minds to the category of unassigned expenses. I protested then not because I expected them to change, but because I needed to hear myself speak the truth. I told them about the shifts, about the nights I sat on my fire escape and counted the stars like coins, about how I had learned to hold my own hand. I told them that loyalty wasn't a line item you moved around when convenient. My father told me I was melodramatic. My sister said she was sorry I felt that way. My mother stood and walked to the window, looking out at a street she had once called home, and said, "We did so much for you when you were younger. You should be grateful for what we gave." Gratitude again, like I was begging for table scraps. I remember the cold sliding under my ribs then, the way their words honed the lines of my face. I packed my toolbox into a plastic tote that night because even that seemed like something I had to take away. I left the house with my hands empty of any blessing they had taken for granted, and with the knowledge that those same hands would have to earn every inch of my life from then on. Later, some people would scoop up this moment and call it business, call it pragmatism, call it tough love. They would say families protect what counts. But what they never acknowledged, what my parents could not see past their neat spreadsheets and their checklist of obligations, was that by engineering a formal abandonment, they were not saving anything. They were converting love into currency and then wondering why it never felt like money could buy back trust. I walked away that night with less than before and with a clarity I had not wanted. They had not only abandoned me emotionally, they had made it legal. They had taken the last vestige of assumed belonging and erased it with ink. The first winter after they made everything official, I slept on a friend's futon and learned how to make silence into a blanket. I worked days at a commercial kitchen washing pans, nights at a 24-hour hardware store stocking shelves, and every hour between those jobs I spent learning a trade I had always loved from a distance: wood. I watched tutorials until my eyes felt like splinters, borrowed a broken table from a curb, and taught myself joints with a borrowed circular saw. I still remember the sting of freezing fingers and the smell of sawdust mixing with cheap coffee. The work was brutal and stupidly specific, and it kept me honest in ways that their polite cruelty never managed to do. It didn't happen fast. For 3 years I slept on couches, ate dinners of canned soup, and held a toolbox like it was a talisman. I took odd jobs that felt beneath me because bills don't care how proud you are. I laid vinyl in a rundown bar, I fixed gutters in the rain, I rebuilt an old church pew for a woman who cried when she saw it because it reminded her of Sunday mornings she thought she'd lost. The money was small, but every nail driven straight was a tiny proof that I could make something whole from scrap. I started selling reclaimed shelving online and to a few local shops. The first time someone paid me in cash for a bookshelf I had built from pallet wood, I cried in my van like an idiot because it felt like a transaction that confirmed I existed outside their ledger. Somewhere in that messy grind I met Mara. She was teaching adult night classes in basic carpentry at the community college, a woman with hands that had learned to build and heal. She taught people how to frame a wall and how to frame a life when your edges were raw. I signed up for a class because I needed to improve my dovetails, and I stayed because she made me feel competent in a way my family never had. We laughed at mistakes together. At the time I glued my thumbnail to a piece of oak and panicked, at the way we sanded away old varnish to reveal grain like a memory. She had scars of her own, an ex who'd taken half her savings and a kid in foster care she fought for until she won. Our histories were not tidy, but they fit against each other like mismatched planks that once sanded made a stronger surface. The business was not a plan at first, it was a stubbornness. I rented a small, freezing workshop above a laundromat, painted its concrete floors with my name and marker, and started taking commissions. I focused on things people needed: sturdy desks, cribs, cabinets built to last rather than trends. Word of mouth is a slow burner, and when it finally caught, it came in bursts. A bar owner who wanted rustic tables, a local magazine that did a spread on makers that featured my reclaimed table and called the studio humble. Then a sales pitch to a boutique hotel led to a larger contract, and suddenly monthly invoices began to look like something other than fantasy. We hired one person, then another. I learned accounting the hard way, with spreadsheets that were more temper tantrum than poetry, and I learned to say no to offers that would shave away the soul of what we made. There was fire in the story, of course, literal and metaphorical. A negligent tenant below the shop left a cigarette in a cardboard box, and I lost nearly everything in a weekend blaze. The studio, raw wood stacked like potential receipts, a handwritten letter from my mother I had kept for reasons I couldn't explain. The community showed up in a way that surprised me. The woman whose pew I had rebuilt started a fundraiser, Mara organized a pop-up sale in a park, and a local chef donated a large order to help us rebuild. I discovered I had customers who had become friends and strangers who wanted to see someone else rise. After the fire, I rebuilt not because I was angry at flames, but because I had finally learned to rely on a different kind of family. We married in the back of that new workshop, under a string of hung bulbs and salvaged chairs, and the first time I held our daughter, a tiny warm thing with my wife's stubborn chin, I felt all the small invisible stitches knitting up inside me. Parenthood was the most ordinary miracle. It rewired my nights and taught me priorities that were not about proving anything to the people who had called me different. They mattered because they were mine, not because they would ever be fed into my parents' narrative. We rented a small house that smelled like paint and possibility, then bought a place with a yard where our son first learned to climb the fence like a little explorer. The kids' laughter built a kind of music I had never known to ask for at my parents' table. The business grew into a brand because we refused to be polished into something we weren't. We were still hands-on, still answering emails at 2 in the morning, still cutting wood at dawn. But eventually we had a showroom, employees who called the studio their career, and a small crew who understood what it meant to craft something with care. People from my old town found the studio online and praised our authenticity in comments without knowing the nights of hunger and legal bruises that backed it. I dated the idea of grand revenge and then let it go. My success wasn't a weapon, it was a byproduct of years of waking up and choosing to build. In the mirror, I stopped looking for their approval. I had built a life that could be counted in scraped knees, in children's drawings pinned to our kitchen corkboard, in invoices paid on time, and in a love that had nothing to do with their approval. The morning I realized they had found out, I was sanding the edge of a dining table and listening to a radio story about small businesses surviving a strange economy. And then Mara's voice cut across the room like someone had opened a window in winter. She was holding a paper towel to her mouth and pointing at my phone, which was playing a clip from a morning show where the host smiled and used my name like a headline. There I was, half sawdust and half grin, talking about why I used reclaimed wood and why things should be made to last. The camera pulled back and the caption said Ash and Oak Studio, and then it showed a wide shot of the old house on Sycamore with our new front sign where the paint had always been peeling before. I set the sander down too hard and the blade jolted in my palm. My heart did some ridiculous thing inside my ribs that I recognized immediately. Other people were seeing what I had built. They found out in a dozen small ways at once, and every one of those ways felt designed to sting. My sister saw the same morning show while sitting in the municipal assistant's office, clutching a paper coffee cup and a thick envelope of foreclosure notices from investors she once charmed. The algorithm shoved the studio's feature in front of her because she had once searched for salvage furniture trends when she was trying to furnish a temporary office. My mother found a glossy spread in a national design magazine left behind in a clinic. The kind of magazine my parents used to keep on the living room table for when guests came over to admire. My father, who now walked with shorter strides and a limp he blamed on arthritis that had no appointment with a health plan, saw my face on a neighborhood bulletin board where the city posted stories about local entrepreneurs. And he stared until someone tapped his shoulder because the tears refused to leave quietly. They looked at my life and measured it against what they had. Sarah's promotion had been a storm in a paper cup. The startup that made her a darling had been exposed for cutting corners, for moving expenses into investor accounts that were not yet secured. There were lawsuits now with names I had never heard, debt collectors with voices that sounded practiced and small. Her husband left when the first round of layoffs threatened their darling image, and suddenly the LinkedIn posts could not be converted back into rent. My mother's retirement fund, which had always been presented like a trophy, had evaporated in the way bad luck and bad advice will make steady things disappear. My father used to enjoy a midday crossword and a cup of big black coffee. Now he passed his days in a half-lit room with the TV murmuring court shows and a foreclosure notice pinned to the wall with a nail. The contrast hit hardest when I saw them, not because I went looking for them, but because the world is small in the way of suburbs and social media. A cousin tagged my mother in a photo of my daughter's birthday on the studio roof garden. That tag landed like a stone in a still pond, and ripples reached my parents before I even knew they were watching. I saw my mother's name pop up in the comments, a brief 3 dots and then nothing. The notification was a small betrayal. Later that afternoon, I got a message from an old aunt I hadn't spoken to in years, full of pity and surprise and the kind of admiration that is both an applause and a finger wag. And she told me they had been at the bank and had looked up my name. They had been reduced to watching from the outside, a slow collapse into public spaces where people sat and read free copies of magazines and where the edges of privacy wore thin. My sister had a new metal bracelet around her wrist and a strange humility that still couldn't hide what she thought she deserved. She saw my workshop pop up on a local good news feed and froze, the way a deer does before it decides which direction saves it. My father went to the library to look up our name because he couldn't bear the thought of asking anyone, and when he turned the page and saw me leaning against a freshly oiled table, smiling with Mara and our kids in the background, his hands trembled in a way I had never associated with him before. I watched all of this like a man who had fixed a window and then noticed people were outside watching the house. It felt surreal and a little obscene, the way private histories were being edited into public narratives. The camera's angle made my life look tidy and intentional, which was true in some ways and a lie in others. It concealed nights of hunger, couch surfing, and the time I panicked into selling a piece too cheap just to keep the lights on. But it also showed something very real: laughter at a table, kids painting with wood stains, a line of employees who called the place a second home. That image hurt them because it was proof that they had lost more than material comfort. It was proof that a life they had presumed they could control had slipped out of their hands and into someone else's care. The cruelest part, if there is a cruelest part, is that they didn't find me in the alley or at a soup kitchen. They found me standing on my own porch, which was loaded now with planters and a bell that still rang when customers came in. They found my wife and my children and a crew that loved the work, and they found evidence that I had been able to turn a fault line into a foundation. For them, it was a mirror held in public and a reminder of the choice they made, and for me it was proof that distance had been a form of medicine. I wanted in that moment to be gentle. I wanted to say quietly that I held no malice, only a life that I had built. But the world has a way of arranging people into scenes, and theirs was now one of quiet ruin in the background of my varnished foreground. They didn't come back honest. They'd learned from their mistakes, or at least they'd learned how to hide them better, and so they built a campaign that looked at first glance like repentance. It began with a box on our doorstep, artisan cookies arranged in a wooden crate with a ribbon and a note in my mother's handwriting that said, "For your family with love." Mara unpacked it and smiled the way people do when they're unsure whether a gift is bait or bread. My daughter wanted to thank them through a scribbled card. My chest tightened because I remembered the nights I ate plain bread while my family clinked crystal over Sarah's latest triumph. The timing was surgical. Then the messages came, dozens of them. Old friends I hadn't heard from in years sent, "How are you?" texts that read like scripts. "I've been thinking about you, we miss your laugh, your kids are beautiful, I'm so glad you're doing well." Somebody from my high school who had once spread gossip now forwarded an article about Ash and Oak Studio with a comment, "So proud of you, friend, when can I bring my cousin by?" Even my mother's sister, who had always been the one to defend me in small ways, showed up at my shop with a casserole and a speech. She hugged Mara and told the children stories about me as if making up for decades of absence could be cured with casserole and confession. It was the way they leaned into our life that made my skin crawl. Invitations came suddenly for holidays and birthdays in their voices that practiced warmth. My sister liked photos on social media within minutes, leaving comments that read like press releases. "So proud. We love you." She posted childhood pictures with captions about forgiveness and family unity, and then messaged privately to ask whether our kids could visit grandma next weekend so she could make up lost time. There were flowers sent to Mara at work with a note about how much they'd always admired her strength. And for a week, the studio smelled like lilies and vague intentions. The flying monkeys showed up in clusters. A cousin who'd always been more interested in my sister's success than in me called and begged me to come to a small family table, saying, "We need to reconnect, it's been too long." A former coworker who owed me for favors and who had never once invited me to drink sent a long email about regret and the importance of lineage, asking me to do the right thing. Even the neighborhood pastor, who used to visit them on Sunday afternoons, started sending videos to my phone about restoration and second chances, always careful to mention bridges that need crossing. Each message was a careful cut polished into a honey tone. I tried to meet them with curiosity at first because curiosity feels like a moral aspiration. I let them come to the studio for one tepid Sunday brunch they organized under the guise of reconciliation. They arrived carrying hand-me-downs for the kids and a homemade quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and intention. They asked about the business like a reporter interviewing a hero, and they complimented the kids on manners they had never taught. My father told the children a story about me as if he had always been in the crowd cheering, and my mother laughed too easily at jokes she had never heard when I was a child. Mara watched them with slow, folded arms, and I watched her watch them because I wanted more than anything to know she would keep our family safe. What clued me in was not a single moment but a vector of small, precise asks that followed the affection. It started in private messages. "We were wondering if you'd help with a short-term loan," my sister wrote in a carefully casual way as if the phrase short-term loan were nothing like "we signed away your security." Then came the emails with attached documents, a lawyer's letter about a potential settlement that needed liquidity, a festival of financial euphemisms. My father asked if I could front him some money for a medical test, and then suggested, with a smile he thought was charming, that perhaps I might consider putting my business as collateral for a line of credit so they could get back on their feet. The words felt like someone trying to rename a bruise. They wanted my help in ways that would pull the thread of my life back under their control. They asked me to casen leases, to list my studio as an endorsing partner for a community grant that would, in their argument, save jobs including Sarah's staffing positions, and to hire Sarah as a consultant on a project that would pay her a salary large enough to drown out the foreclosure notices she kept posting on Instagram. They asked for an itemized loan to be wired that night, just until the paperwork cleared. They claimed humility and penury with the same breath, practicing the posture of the ruined that wanted to be restored by my hands. The most manipulative request perhaps came dressed as concern for the kids. My mother asked if she could visit the grandchildren to make up for missed birthdays, and my sister said softly that they wanted to be a family again and that the kids deserved both sets of grandparents. I could feel the strategy behind it, proximity as leverage. If they could be in our home for an afternoon, they could charm our circle, learn our routines, and find a way to ask for more without tipping into cruelty. The old scripts played out like a rehearsal they had been studying for years. I knew in that moment that the love bombing was not love, it was a campaign. It had the polished cadence of guilt weaponized into charm. I felt cold and furious and weary in equal measures because the people who had cast me out had become masters of the language of pity. They wanted to use my success as a bridge to bail themselves out, to sew their failures into my seams so they could be carried once again. I had built everything by refusing to be carried. That knowledge sat in me like a compass and an ache, and the next choice I had to make felt heavier than any table I had ever lifted. They came on a rainy Thursday, like a bad weather front you can see coming but can't quite stop. I was in the shop finishing a commission for a client who wanted a dining table with a story carved into its apron when Mara's hand on my shoulder made me look up. They were on the sidewalk, a slow procession that should have stayed in a photograph and not in front of my studio. My mother held a paper bag like it contained something holy. My father walked with that limp I'd seen on the community videos, but his chest was puffed like he still had the right to own the air in front of him. Sarah came last, hair longer than I'd seen at that coronation dinner, face hollowed in a way the camera can't always capture. She held a folder like it was proof that the universe owed her a living. They didn't bother with the puppy dog act anymore. They stood under the awning, wet at the hem, and my mother said my name like she was testing whether it still belonged to me. There was no ribbon on the bag this time, no polite casserole, no pastor's scripture. She started with the soft voice that had always been her weapon when we were small, the one that could make a reprimand sound like comfort. "We are so sorry," she said, and the apology came out like a rehearsed chorus. My father nodded, perfect cadence, like two people reading the same script. But Sarah didn't look sorry. Her eyes were tired in a way you only get from sleeping on wallets and counting on other people's patience. They moved fast. My father opened the folder and laid out pages like they were trump cards, bank statements lined up in a way that suggested inevitability. "We have nowhere else to go," he said, as if I'd been holding a spare roof in my back pocket. "Sarah's legal bills are more than we imagined. The investors pulled out. We thought we'd have time to refinance, but we don't. We need a loan. We need you." My sister's voice was small but sharp. She didn't beg so much as demand with the entitlement of someone who had been handed promise after promise and expected the world to keep delivering. They wanted the studio to front them credibility. They wanted me to sign a document that would list them as guarantors using my business assets as collateral. They wanted me to lease them a small space inside the workshop under the pretense of helping Sarah do freelance consulting, which would actually put her on the payroll and give them access to our bank statements for loan applications. They wanted me to toss in a line of credit for my father that would cover his medical expenses and their mortgage arrears, just until things stabilize. The audacity wasn't that they wanted money. The audacity was the blithe way they acted like I should still be on call for their financial crises after everything they'd engineered. When I said nothing at first, Sarah leaned forward with a kind of practice charm that had always been calibrated to a crowd that applauded her. "We never meant to push you out," she said, as if the months of being erased were a bookkeeping error. "You always had your stubborn streak, but look where you landed. We thought you understood why we had to protect the house. We were scared and we thought." Her words slid into a plea that was part performance, part weapon. My mother took over like a conductor. "We thought the best thing for the family was to make choices. You were doing so well on your own," she said, and offered me that same old line as if repetition would make it true. The request was specific and surgical. They wanted me to use my business credit to secure a bridge loan of $50,000, to front a payroll guarantee for Sarah's consulting firm so investors would come back, and to list my parents' names on a title for a condo they intended to put my father's name on as a temporary address. They expected that a man who had started with a plastic tote and carved his own table might still have a vault of spare favors. They demanded terms like a banker, and then invoked the language of relatives like saints. At one point, my father looked at me and said without a tremor, "We did what we had to do to protect the family legacy." The sentence landed like fresh concrete. The tone was casual, like weather report. I watched my hands, the palms calloused from years of swinging hammers and making things true with wood and sweat, and felt a hot, slow tide of something that could have been anger or could have been pity. My sister asked for a week to be set up, a fortnight to get her consulting practice running in the studio, and then casually whether I might consider transferring a small equity share for administrative purposes. The sheer gall of asking for ownership in what I had built from ash and a van with a broken heater was a cinematic cruelty. They spoke of hardship with the confidence of people who had always believed hardships belonged to other people. They presented receipts of ruin like props, as if a foreclosure notice were a tear-jerking badge of honor that entitled them to my labor. They acted as if the past, years where my requests for help were met with scorn or derision, had been erased by a morning show and a magazine spread. They wanted me to stitch their failures into my success without offering anything but the murky apology that had been practiced in front of a mirror. What made it worse was how they tried to weaponize the kids. My mother said softly that our children deserved both sets of grandparents, that it would be good for them to have family support. Sarah chimed in with a line about legacy and lineage, and I could see the calculation in her face. Get close to the children, get close to the household rhythms, get leverage. The audacity of it felt like a hand reaching to cut the stitches on a life I had sewn together myself. They were asking me plainly to make myself vulnerable again so they could climb back onto the things I had built. The humiliation of that ask, delivered in rain and in front of my employees who had come out to see what was happening, was hard and absurd and finally very, very raw. They reacted the way things react when you stop feeding them, with a frenzy that made no sense unless you knew they had been depending on me to keep breathing. At first, there were little things that could be laughed off, a smear comment here, a nasty anonymous review there, but the pattern turned into a stampede fast. I watched my inbox fill with messages flagged urgent, then angry calls from vendors I'd trusted for years, then a torrent of DMs on social media from strangers accusing me of malpractice and shoddy construction. Someone had doctored a photo of a child's crib, blurred it, and posted it with a caption alleging negligence. My phone buzzed in my hand like a hive. For the first few hours I thought it would blow over. It didn't. The escalation came in waves and with a precision that suggested planning. A man in a cheap suit turned up at the studio on a Tuesday and demanded to see my business license, waving a notary-stamped letter with my name misspelled and my signature forged. He left after Mara called the police and his copy of the order dissolved into nothing on the hood of his car. 2 nights later, our van's tires were slashed, and the next morning our back window was shattered by a rock with a note left in the center that said simply, "Pay up." My hands shook when I swept glass into the dustpan because the pattern they were tracing was so clear. They wanted me scared, small, willing to hand everything back for the sake of quiet. They tried more refined violence, too. My sister called a meeting with a local community fund where I had applied for a small grant, and she planted stories about me being cutthroat with employees, that I paid below minimum wage, that our workshop skirted safety codes. A phone call from the inspector came the next week and an official walked in expecting chaos. Instead, he saw first aid kits, PPE stacked on a shelf, an employee handbook with signatures, and an OSHA poster. He left embarrassed and apologized. The damage had already been done because the grant committee had been seeded with doubt. They had learned to weaponize suspicion. Slander turned to attempts at legal sabotage. A lawyer's letter arrived one morning alleging I had sold family heirlooms that belonged to the estate and demanded an inventory list and immediate return. It was a transparent lie. I had receipts for the reclaimed wood and names of folks who watched me build at night. Still, the letter made a bank pause on a line of credit I was negotiating, freezing funds that would have paid wages that week. They filed a lien on an old delivery truck, claiming it had been gifted to me and thus part of the estate. When I went down to the courthouse to object, their lawyer smiled like a man who had practiced cruelty for sport. The judge lifted the lien on a technicality, but the interruption meant one contractor walked away and one wedding order got canceled. Their claws reached into the small mortal rhythms that kept our doors open. The cruelty grew stranger and colder. Somebody filed an anonymous complaint with Child Protective Services accusing me of letting the kids play with dangerous tools unsupervised and suggesting the workshop was an unsafe environment. I answered the knock with my daughter's crayons in my hand and watched the caseworker poke at a stack of sanded boards and smile when she saw the safety gates, the helmets, the signed release forms our school required for field trips. But the fear had been implanted. My daughter watched me that night with eyes that had seen the arrival of people with serious faces and strange questions. And for the first time, I felt my role as protector warp into something fragile and always provisional. They hired a private investigator who showed up at odd hours asking neighbors whether I kept odd hours, whether they had ever seen me with suspicious packages. He came back with nothing, but he had a talent for insinuation. He took photos of our dumpster and implied we were hiding evidence. He attempted to bribe one of my crew with cash and promises of a job in Sarah's future firm if he would give up our client list. My guy laughed and walked away. Loyalty isn't a banknote for everyone, but their reach was contagious enough that one employee left a week later, scared of the phone calls that came to his home. The final burst, the last desperate tantrum, was public and ugly. They organized a protest outside the studio, a pained little assembly of cousins and acquaintances who held cardboard signs accusing me of theft and of abandoning family. My mother delivered a speech about legacy with a voice that sounded like it had been prepared on morning radio. Sarah screamed my name in the microphone, tears wetting her cheeks in the way performance moisture can be wet, and a camera streamed it to a local gossip feed within minutes. Someone doused our shop sign in paint. Someone else cut a banner across our front window with a message fabricated out of fear. People who had watched me hand over tables to their parents for graduations and weddings came and stood at the doorway confused, uncomfortable, their faces asking the question of the crowd: is this any of it true? What catapulted me through whatever shock I felt was seeing the strain on my crew, the way their eyes flicked to me like they expected me to solve the weather. I had by then a folder of everything: donations list, invoices, signed contracts, tax returns, timestamped social posts that proved where bills had come from. I had recorded calls where my sister asked for money, emails where my parents tried to charm and then threaten. I gave the folder to a lawyer who moved like someone who had seen the play before. We filed restraining orders, we countersued for slander when the lies cost contracts, and we handed hard copies of the forged signature to the police. The first arrests were for trespass and vandalism. The slander cases unspooled more slowly, but the network I had built rallied. Clients wrote testimonials. Neighbors testified about the many afternoons I had fixed a broken porch for nothing or helped nail up a sign for someone else. Their extinction burst burned hot and then, like any fuel-starved flare, sputtered. The protesters dwindled, the smear articles cooled without fresh accusations, and the parking lot eventually cleared. They left a lot of wreckage, paint, broken glass, a week of canceled orders, but they also left me something clearer. The truth about them was no longer private and the community had seen the proof. I patched the glass, paid the invoices, held my kids close that night and let them know that we were safe. I felt hollow and furious and strangely relieved. When the police drove them away after a late-night confrontation where my father threw a metal sign through our neighbor's window and called the officers liars, I watched them go with no satisfaction at all. Only the tired relief that comes when a long, ugly fight ends and you are still standing. I did not raise my voice. I never have been one for theatrical yelling. I let my hands rest on the edge of the workbench in the studio, felt the grain of the wood under my palms, and I spoke like someone reading the ledger of his own life aloud so everybody could hear the math. They stood under the awning, the same people who had once clapped for Sarah like confetti, wet and embarrassed, like a cheap show that had finally been canceled. I told them the facts in plain sentences because facts are hard to lie to, and because after everything they had done I owed myself the truth spoken clearly. I reminded them first of the small betrayals, the way neglect arrived like steady weather. I said I remembered report cards folded like a newspaper and placed on the couch, remembered stitches of different and sensitive sewn into the seams of every dinner conversation. I told them I remembered my room left dark, photos cropped to favor her, birthday candles that were reserved for a champion I never was supposed to be. I said I remembered promises that sounded like warmth and cost nothing, and how those promises kept coming until one night they put papers on a table and turned the word family into an accounting problem. Then I unpacked the last legal knife. I told them in a voice that would not break how they had turned what should have been a home into collateral, how signatures had been collected in quiet offices, and my name removed from halls I thought I might inherit even if only in memory. I spoke about the lawyer's letter that blackened my childhood with technicalities, about the lien that tried to put a claim on a delivery truck I had paid for with my own sweat, and about the way it felt to watch the last comfortable things I had expected from them be inked away. My words were plain. There were receipts and dates and an ugly chronology I had kept in a folder for nights like this. I did not rehearse righteous fury. I said instead how I survived. Nights on futons, hands bandaged from a saw, clients I found one at a time, the van that smelled of sawdust and cheap coffee, the first time someone paid me cash for a bookshelf and I cried in my van because proof tastes like metal sometimes. I spoke about Mara teaching night classes and how she made me believe I could be a craftsman and a father rather than a punchline. I spoke about our kids, about the sound of laughter that stitched a place in me where their neglect could not reach. My voice softened as I talked about our crew who had learned to call the studio a second home, and about neighbors who had stood with us when the protest signs came. When I turned back to them, I stripped away the performative sorrow. I quoted their asks word for word. I said aloud the sentences they expected would pull me back. Please front us the loan, cost in the mortgage, lease a corner of the studio, hire Sarah so her payroll could be proof of solvency. I told them how their "we were scared" had always left me as the one expected to fix fear with my labor. I asked where the calls had been when my rent was late and nobody sent flowers for that. I asked where the hands were when I had a fever. The silence in their faces said what words could not. Then I delivered the verdict, measured because I wanted it to be final and not the rolling fog of more bargaining. I told them I would not consign, I would not lend, and I would not let my life be used as a bridge to mend a pattern of exploitation. I told them I had already taken steps to protect what we had built, restraining orders where they had been needed, countersuits where their lies had cost wages, insurance claims that replaced what their vandals had tried to take, and community testimonials that had repaired the reputational damage they tried to cause. I said I had closed the doors they could push through and changed the locks in the legal sense and the human sense. I had no more credit extended for use as someone else's parachute. People expect a melodramatic speech in these moments. They want fire and thunder. I spoke instead about mercy and boundaries. I said I offered no dramatic show of forgiveness because forgiveness without accountability is a stage trick. I offered calmly the only thing that felt honest. I would keep my children safe, I would not open the house to manipulations, and if they ever wanted real reconciliation, they would have to do work that cannot be bought with casseroles or headlines. They would have to come clean with restitution where it was owed, face the legal consequences of their fabrications, and do the long, quiet labor of proving they had changed, not merely rehearsed for the camera. When I finished, I walked them to the studio door. Mara stood behind me, our kids quiet and solemn at her side, faces full of the kind of trust you do not earn in a press release. I locked the door and handed my parents a short letter I had written the night before. No assistance, no access, no forgiveness for now, with an outline of steps that would be required if they meant to be in our lives again. It was not cruelty. It was the end of being fuel for someone else's panic. I watched them go, not shouting, not pleading, just small and human, and felt a strange relief that was both heavy and clean. I have been tempted more than once to use this story as a weapon back at them. I have not. I refuse to make my life an instrument of punishment. My verdict was not vengeance. It was a boundary that kept my children safe, preserved the dignity of the people who worked beside me, and finally allowed me to choose the family that kept showing up. I turned back to the shop, to the smell of sawdust and oil, to the sound of my daughter practicing a new song on a battered ukulele, and to Mara's hand on my shoulder. That is the life I chose. That is the peace I will keep.